The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the flickering candle on the nightstand. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and desire, the kind of atmosphere that made it hard to breathe, but impossible to leave. His hands trembled as they traced the curve of her back, her skin warm and smooth under his fingertips. She arched into his touch, a soft moan escaping her lips, and he felt his resolve crumble. He shouldn't be here. He shouldn't be doing this. But the way she looked at him, the way she whispered his name, made it impossible to stop. Her breath hitched as his lips found hers, the kiss deep and hungry, filled with all the pent-up longing he had tried so hard to suppress. She was his student, for God's sake. 18 years old, barely an adult, and yet she had a power over him that he couldn't explain. He had tried to resist, tried to keep his distance, but every time she smiled at him, every time she leaned in just a little too close, he felt himself slipping further into the abyss. Her fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, and he groaned against her mouth. He knew this was wrong, knew it could ruin him, but in that moment, he didn't care. All he cared about was the way she made him feel alive, wanted, needed. He had spent years in a loveless marriage, years of feeling invisible, and now for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt seen. But even as he lost himself in her, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that this couldn't last. That sooner or later the truth would come out, and when it did, there would be no going back. It had started innocently enough, or at least, that's what he told himself. Jonathan Hayes was a respected English professor at Haverford College, a small liberal arts institution nestled in the rolling hills of New England. At 42, he had carved out a life that suited him, a predictable rhythm of teaching classes, grading papers, and retreating to his modest apartment each evening with a glass of Cabernet and a weathered copy of Middlemarch, or The Wasteland. His office, lined with sagging bookshelves and adorned with faded literary posters, was his sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in the words of dead poets and novelists. He was known among students and faculty alike for his sharp wit, his dry humor, and an almost encyclopedic passion for literature that could turn a lecture on Dickens into a performance worthy of the stage. His life hadn't always been so solitary. There had been a marriage once, a union that unraveled quietly over a decade ago. It had been a slow drift rather than a dramatic rupture. Two people who simply stopped recognizing each other in the spaces they once shared. The divorce left him with a sense of relief rather than regret, a shedding of weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. There were no children to tether him to his ex-wife or to anyone else, no family gatherings or school plays to fill his calendar. His parents had passed years earlier, and his only sibling, a sister, lived halfway across the country with a bustling family of her own. For the most part, Jonathan was content with his quiet existence. He had his books, his routines, his carefully curated solitude. It was enough, or so he'd convinced himself. But then she walked into his classroom. It was the first day of the fall semester. A crisp September morning when the leaves outside the lecture hall windows were just beginning to turn gold and crimson. The room smelled faintly of old wood and chalk dust, and the rows of desks were filled with the usual mix of students, some eager, some indifferent, all scribbling notes or staring blankly at the syllabus he'd handed out. Jonathan stood at the front, his tweed blazer slightly wrinkled, his dark hair streaked with the first hints of gray, delivering his opening remarks about the semester's focus on 19th century British literature. His voice was steady, practiced, as he outlined the readings: Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, Great Expectations, and the expectations for the term papers. That's when the door creaked open, just a few minutes late, and Emily Carter stepped inside. She paused in the doorway, her presence commanding attention without effort. She was young, 20, maybe 21, with an energy that seemed to ripple through the room like a sudden breeze. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, glinting with shades of copper and red, and her green eyes scanned the room briefly before settling on him. She wore a simple outfit: jeans, a cream-colored sweater, a scarf looped loosely around her neck, but there was something about the way she carried herself, a quiet confidence that made her stand out against the backdrop of sleepy undergraduates. "Sorry I'm late, Professor Hayes," she said, her voice clear and unapologetic as she slid into an empty seat near the front. "I got turned around in the quad." He nodded, brushing off the interruption with a wave of his hand. "No trouble, Just grab a syllabus from the stack and follow along. But as he resumed his lecture, he felt her gaze linger on him, steady and unflinching, and for the first time in years he stumbled over a sentence, something about Heathcliff's brooding nature, before catching himself and moving on. Emily Carter was everything he wasn't. Young, vibrant, full of life. She had a way of lighting up a room just by being in it. A quality that transcended her physical presence and seeped into the air around her. From that first day, Jonathan found himself captivated, though he wouldn't admit it, not yet. She was a junior, an English major with a minor in philosophy, and she threw herself into the class with a fervor that set her apart. Her hand shot up during discussions, her questions sharp and probing, cutting through the usual haze of half-formed thoughts from her peers. She challenged his interpretations of Rochester's morality, in Jane Eyre, debated the symbolism of the moors in Wuthering Heights, and once spent 10 minutes dissecting a single stanza of Tennyson's In Memoriam, with a precision that left him both impressed and faintly unsettled. At first, he told himself it was just admiration. She was a talented student, a rare gem in a sea of mediocrity, and he was a dedicated teacher who valued intellectual curiosity. There was nothing wrong with appreciating her mind, with wanting to nurture her potential. He'd had brilliant students before, though none quite like her, and he prided himself on maintaining professional boundaries. But as the weeks slipped by, the lines he'd drawn in his mind began to blur, smudged by details he couldn't ignore. He noticed the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that echoed in the classroom long after she'd stopped. He caught himself watching the way her hair fell over her shoulders when she leaned forward to scribble notes, the strands catching the light in a way that made them look almost alive. Her handwriting, he observed one day when she handed in an essay, was a neat cursive that slanted slightly to the right, each letter deliberate and graceful. During office hours, when she dropped by to discuss a reading or ask for feedback on a draft, he found himself lingering longer than necessary, inventing tangents about Shelley or Keats, just to keep her there, perched on the edge of the chair across from his desk. He wasn't a fool. He knew the risks, the ethics, the power imbalance that loomed between them like an unspoken rule carved in stone. He was her professor, twice her age, a man whose life had settled into a predictable groove while hers was just beginning to unfold. And yet the more he tried to rationalize it, the more he felt himself slipping, drawn to her like a moth to a flame, aware of the danger but unable to turn away. It was late October when the moment arrived, a turning point he'd replay in his mind for weeks to come. The leaves outside had deepened to a fiery red, and the campus was quiet, the air sharp with the promise of winter. His afternoon seminar had just ended, a 2-hour dive into Bleak House that left most of the students bleary-eyed and shuffling out the door. Jonathan stood at the front of the room, gathering his notes and adjusting the stack of books under his arm. When he realized Emily hadn't left, she lingered by her desk, packing her bag with deliberate slowness, her movements unhurried as the last of her classmates filed out. The classroom was silent now, save for the faint rustle of papers and the distant hum of voices drifting through the hall. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long, golden shadows across the worn wooden floor. Emily approached him, her footsteps soft against the creak of the floorboards, and stopped just a few feet away, closer than she needed to be, close enough that he could smell the faint citrus scent of her perfume. "Professor Hayes," she said, her voice low and soft, barely above a whisper, "I was wondering if you could help me with something." Her words hung in the air, simple, yet weighted with an undercurrent he couldn't ignore. She looked up at him, her green eyes wide and unguarded, framed by lashes that caught the light. There was an innocence in her expression. But something else too, a flicker of intent, a quiet daring that made his pulse quicken. He stood frozen, his hands still clutching his lecture notes, the edges of the paper crumpling slightly under his grip. He knew he should say no. Every instinct, every shred of professionalism screamed at him to step back, to put a desk or a chair or an entire continent between them. He could hear the voice of reason in his head, reciting the college's code of conduct, the consequences of crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But his throat was dry, his heart hammering against his ribs, and instead of retreating he found himself nodding, the motion almost involuntary. "Of course," he said, his voice rough, strained, as if the words had been dragged out of him. "What do you need?" She smiled, then a slow, knowing smile that spread across her lips like a secret unfolding. It wasn't the bright, carefree grin she flashed in class. This was different, deliberate, laced with something that sent a shiver racing down his spine. She took a step closer, closing the already narrow gap between them, and tilted her head slightly, her hair slipping over one shoulder. "I think you know," she said, her voice a soft murmur that seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. Before he could process her words, before he could summon the willpower to pull away, she leaned in. Her lips brushed his tentative at first, then firm, warm, and unyielding. The world tilted, the classroom fading into a haze of sensation. The faint taste of mint on her breath, the softness of her mouth, the heat of her body so close to his. His notes slipped from his hands, scattering across the floor, but he barely noticed. For a moment he was lost, caught in a current he couldn't fight. And then, just as suddenly, she pulled back, her eyes searching his. The smile was gone, replaced by a look he couldn't quite read. Triumph, maybe, or uncertainty, or both. She didn't say anything, just turned and walked out, leaving him standing there breathless and undone, the echo of her kiss burning on his lips. It had started innocently enough, or at least, that's what he told himself. But as he bent to gather his scattered papers, his hands trembling, he knew the truth. There was no going back. From that moment on, Jonathan was lost. The kiss in the classroom had unraveled him, threading itself into every corner of his mind, like a persistent melody he couldn't shake. He tried to rationalize it in the days that followed, pacing the hardwood floors of his apartment late at night with a glass of wine in hand. The crimson liquid sloshing against the rim as he muttered to himself. It was just a fling, he reasoned, a fleeting lapse in judgment. A spark that would flicker and die out as quickly as it had ignited. He'd been alone too long, that was all. His solitude had made him vulnerable, susceptible to the allure of something forbidden. It would pass. It had to. But the truth was undeniable, a quiet confession he couldn't outrun. He had never felt this way before. Emily consumed him, body and soul, her presence seeping into his every thought like ink spreading across a page. He saw her face when he closed his eyes, those wide green eyes that held both innocence and something darker. Her auburn hair cascading in waves he longed to touch. At night she haunted his dreams, her laughter echoing through imagined scenes of sunlit fields or dimly lit rooms, her voice calling his name in a whisper that jolted him awake, breathless and disoriented. During the day she was no less present, her image flickering behind his eyelids as he lectured on Tess of the D'Urbervilles, or graded papers in his cluttered office, the red pen trembling slightly in his hand. He found himself rearranging his life around her, subtly at first, then with a desperation that startled him. Meetings with colleagues, dry discussions about curriculum updates or faculty budgets, were pushed aside with vague excuses about prior commitments. Social events, rare as they were, became non-negotiable absences. He declined invitations to dinners at the dean's house or drinks at the local pub, citing a backlog of work that didn't exist. His evenings, once reserved for solitude and the comfort of his books, now belonged to her. He craved her presence, the sound of her voice, the electric thrill of her nearness, and he bent his world to accommodate it. At first it was just stolen moments, fleeting and clandestine, each one a pulse of adrenaline that left him dizzy. A quick kiss in his office after hours, the door locked and the blinds drawn, her lips soft and insistent against his. A furtive brush of her hand against his in the hallway, as they passed between classes, her fingers lingering just long enough to send a jolt through him. He'd catch her eye across the lecture hall during seminars, her gaze locking with his for a fraction of a second, a secret shared in plain sight before she turned back to her notes with that faint, knowing smile. These encounters were brief, charged with risk, and they fueled him, stoking a fire he hadn't known he could still feel. But soon, those fragments weren't enough. The hunger grew, insatiable, pulling them beyond the confines of the college's ivy-covered walls. It was Emily who suggested it first, her voice casual yet deliberate as they stood in his office. One rainy afternoon, the sound of water pattering against the window pane. "What if I came to your place?" she'd asked, leaning against his desk, her fingers tracing the edge of a book he'd left open. Middle March, its pages dog-eared and annotated. He'd hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in, but the look in her eyes, bold, unflinching, silenced his objections before they could form. That night, she slipped through the back door of his small Victorian-era house on the edge of town, her footsteps muffled by the overgrown grass of the yard. The house was a relic, its exterior weathered by years of New England winters, its interior a maze of narrow hallways and creaking floorboards. Jonathan had lived there alone since the divorce, filling it with bookshelves and mismatched furniture, a worn leather armchair by the fireplace, a scratched oak table in the kitchen where he ate his solitary meals. He'd never thought of it as a place for company, let alone this. But when Emily stepped inside, shaking rain from her hair and grinning at him, it transformed. The dim light of the living room lamps cast her in a warm glow, and the space felt alive, vibrant, as if it had been waiting for her. They spent hours together that first night, the world outside fading into irrelevance. They talked about literature at first, her thoughts on Eliot's prose spilling out with an enthusiasm that matched his own. Then about everything else, her childhood in a small coastal town, his years studying abroad in Oxford, the dreams they'd both harbored and abandoned. Laughter came easily, her quick wit drawing him out of his usual reserve, and he found himself telling stories he hadn't shared in years, amusing anecdotes from his grad school days, dry observations about the quirks of their colleagues. The conversation flowed into silences that weren't awkward but charged, their eyes meeting across the room, the air thick with unspoken want. And then there was the physical, the making love, that felt less like a calculated act, and more like an inevitable collision. It happened on the faded rug in front of the fireplace, the flames crackling as shadows danced across the walls. Her skin was warm against his, her breath ragged in his ear, and he lost himself in her, in the reckless abandon of it all. Afterward, they lay tangled together, her head resting on his chest, the quiet hum of her breathing lulling him into a peace he hadn't known in years. He felt like a teenager again, giddy and unmoored, every nerve alight with a vitality he'd thought long extinguished. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he was truly alive. She came again the next night, and the night after that, her visits becoming a rhythm as steady as the tides. She'd arrive after dark, her knock soft but insistent, and he'd let her in, the routine settling into something both thrilling and familiar. They'd cook together sometimes, simple meals like pasta with store-bought sauce or scrambled eggs at midnight, laughing over spilled wine or burnt toast. Other nights, they'd skip the pretense of dinner altogether, falling into each other with a hunger that never seemed to dull. The house, once a mausoleum of his solitude, became their sanctuary, its walls holding secrets no one else could know. But even as he reveled in their relationship, a shadow lingered at the edges of his joy, a doubt he couldn't fully banish. Emily was young, 21, he'd learned. Her birthday passing in early November, with a quiet celebration at his kitchen table, a single candle flickering in a slice of grocery store cake. She was beautiful, her features sharp yet soft, her laugh a melody that could turn heads in a crowded room. She was full of life, her future stretching out before her like an open road. Graduate school, a career, a world of possibilities he'd long since left behind. And he was 42, a middle-aged professor, with graying hair and a life that had settled into a groove of predictability. He had nothing to offer but his love, a fragile gift wrapped in the baggage of his years. What could she possibly see in him? He tried to push the thought aside, to drown it in the immediacy of her presence. The feel of her hand in his, the sound of her voice reading aloud from a book of poetry she'd found on this shelf. He focused on the present, on the stolen hours that felt like a dream he didn't want to wake from. But the doubt persisted, a quiet gnawing in the back of his mind, a whisper that all of this was too good to be true. She was a comet blazing through his sky, brilliant and fleeting, and he was a man tethered to earth, waiting for the inevitable fall. And then one day, he found out the truth. It was a Wednesday in mid-December, the campus blanketed in a thin layer of snow that crunched underfoot as he walked from his car to the English department building. The semester was winding down, finals looming, and the air was thick with the tension of deadlines. He'd spent the morning grading essays in his office, the heater rattling in the corner, when he decided to stretch his legs and check his mailbox in the faculty lounge. The room was empty when he arrived. The coffee pot cold, the bulletin board plastered with flyers for holiday parties and student recitals. He rifled through the stack of envelopes in his slot bills, a journal subscription renewal, a memo from the dean, until his fingers brushed something unexpected, A small, unsealed envelope with no name or address. Just a folded piece of paper inside. He pulled it out, curiosity piqued, and unfolded it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, blocky, and uneven, the ink smudged in places, as if written in haste. The message was short, 5 words that hit him like a punch to the gut. "She's playing you." His breath caught, the paper trembling in his hands as he read it again, then a third time, searching for meaning in the sparse lines. Who had written it? What did they know? His mind raced, conjuring images of Emily, her smile, her touch, the way she looked at him when they were alone, and then twisting them, staining them with suspicion. Was it a prank, a jealous classmate, a colleague who'd seen too much? Or was it something more, something real? He stuffed the note into his pocket and left the lounge, his steps unsteady as he returned to his office. The doubt he'd buried flared to life, sharp and insistent, and as he sank into his chair, staring at the snow falling outside, he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, and it would change everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon in mid-December, the kind of day where the sky hung low and gray over Haverford College, casting a pallor over the snow-dusted campus. Jonathan Hayes sat in his office. A cramped room on the second floor of the English department building, surrounded by the familiar clutter of his life. Bookshelves sagged under the weight of novels and critical essays, their spines cracked and faded from years of use. A single window overlooked the quad, its panes rattling faintly as the wind gusted outside, sending flurries of snow skittering across the glass. His desk was a battlefield of papers, student essays, lecture notes, a half-empty mug of coffee gone cold hours ago, and he hunched over it, red pen in hand, squinting at the cramped handwriting of a particularly convoluted analysis of the turn of the screw. The essay was a slog, riddled with tangled sentences and shaky arguments about James's use of ambiguity, and Jonathan's patience was wearing thin. He scribbled a note in the margin, "Clarify your thesis," and rubbed his temples, the dull ache of a headache creeping in. The radiator in the corner hissed intermittently, filling the room with a dry heat that did little to chase away the chill seeping through the old walls. He glanced at the clock on his desk. 3:47. Emily was supposed to come by his house that evening, as she had nearly every night for the past month. The thought of her warmed him, a flicker of anticipation cutting through the monotony of his task. He imagined her stepping through the back door, shaking snow from her auburn hair, her green eyes bright as she teased him about his terrible cooking, or pulled a book from his shelf to read aloud. He was just finishing the essay, circling a final grade, B-, when his phone buzzed against the desk, jolting him from his reverie. He reached for it, the screen lighting up with a text from Emily, his lips curved into a faint smile as he opened it, expecting one of her playful messages, maybe a quip about the weather or a promise to bring wine. Instead, the words were stark, unadorned. "Can't meet tonight." Something came up. He frowned, a twinge of disappointment settling in his chest. It wasn't the first time she'd canceled. There had been a handful of occasions over the past few weeks when she'd texted last-minute miligas, citing a group project or a late shift at the campus library where she worked part-time. Each time she'd followed up with a flurry of regret. "I'm so sorry, I hate this. I'll make it up to you," and she always did, showing up the next night with a sheepish grin and a kiss that erased any lingering frustration. He typed a quick response, his thumbs tapping against the screen. "Everything okay?" Then he set the phone down, expecting her usual prompt reply. But the minutes ticked by, and the screen remained dark. He tried to focus on the next essay, a meandering take on Heart of Darkness. But his eyes kept drifting to the phone, waiting for it light up. An hour passed, then 2, the silence stretching thin and taut. He picked up the phone again, rereading her message, searching for some hidden meaning in its brevity. Something came up. It was vague, uncharacteristically so for her, she who could spin a story out of nothing, who filled their conversations with vivid details about her day. He tapped out another text, "Just checking in, let me know when you're free," and hit send, the whoosh of the message echoing faintly in the quiet room. Still nothing. By 6 p.m., as the sky outside deepened to a bruised purple and the campus lights flickered on, he tried calling. The phone rang once, then cut straight to voicemail, her cheerful recording filling his ear. "Hey, it's Emily. Leave a message. I'll get back to you." He hung up without speaking, his throat tight. He told himself she was fine, probably just caught up in some mundane errand, her phone dead or forgotten in her bag. She'd call later, laughing about whatever had delayed her, and they'd pick up where they left off. But the nagging doubt that had shadowed him for weeks, the one he buried under the weight of their stolen moments, stirred awake, whispering questions he didn't want to answer. He left the office that evening with a knot in his stomach, his briefcase slung over his shoulder as he trudged through the snow to his car. The parking lot was nearly empty, the faculty having lecked out for the night, and his old sedan sat alone under a street lamp, its windshield dusted white. He drove home in silence, the radio off, the hum of the engine and the crunch of tires on salted roads, the only sounds. His house was dark when he arrived, the porch light casting a weak glow over the front steps. Inside, he flicked on the lamps and poured himself a glass of Cabernet, the ritual feeling hollow without her there to share it. He sat in his leather armchair by the fireplace, staring at the unlit logs and waited for his phone to buzz. It did. Sleep eluded him that night. He lay in bed, the sheets cold against his skin, replaying her text in his mind. Something came up. The words looped endlessly, each repetition feeding the unease that gnawed at him. He drifted into a fitful doze near dawn, waking to a gray morning with the same unanswered questions heavy in his chest. The next day was Wednesday, and he had his seminar at 10 a.m., the class Emily was in, the one where it had all begun. He arrived early, setting up in the lecture hall with mechanical precision. Syllabus on the podium, chalk in hand, a stack of handouts on Bleak House neatly aligned. The room filled slowly, students trickling in with scarves and heavy coats, their breath visible in the chilly air. He kept his eyes on the door, waiting for her, his pulse quickening as the clock ticked closer to the hour. She walked in at 9:58, just before he called the class to order. She looked as beautiful as ever, her auburn hair tied back in a loose ponytail that swayed as she moved, strands slipping free to frame her face. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, a soft pink against her pale skin, and she wore a thick sweater over jeans, her boots leaving faint, wet prints on the floor. She slid into her usual seat near the front, her bag thudding against the desk, and flashed him a smile as she settled in. But there was something off about it, something forced, the corners of her mouth tight, her eyes not quite meeting his. It wasn't the warm conspiratorial grin he'd grown used to, the one that carried their secret across the room. His stomach twisted. He started the lecture, his voice steady as he guided the class through Dickens's labyrinthine prose, but his attention was fractured. He tried to catch her eye, leaning on old habits, pausing mid-sentence to glance her way, lingering on her when he posed a question to the group. She didn't look up. Her head stayed bent over her notebook, her pen moving in quick, deliberate strokes, her focus absolute. Once he thought he saw her shoulders tense when he called on a student sitting beside her, but she didn't lift her gaze. The hour dragged, each minute a small eternity, and by the time he dismissed the class, his palms were damp with sweat. "Emily," he said as the room emptied, his tone casual but firm, "could you stay back a moment?" She froze mid-motion, her hands halfway through packing her bag. The other students filed out, their chatter fading down the hall, and she hesitated, her fingers tightening on the strap of her backpack. Finally, she nodded, a small, reluctant dip of her head, and followed him as he led the way to his office. The walk was silent, their footsteps echoing in the corridor, the air thick with unspoken tension. He unlocked the door, ushering her inside, and closed it behind them with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. The office was as it had been the day before. Papers strewn across the desk, books teetering on the shelves, the radiator humming faintly. He turned to face her, leaning against the edge of his desk to steady himself, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. She stood near the door, her bag still slung over one shoulder, her posture stiff. Up close he could see the faint shadows under her eyes, the way her lips pressed together, as if holding something back. "Is everything okay?" he asked, forcing his voice to stay even, though it wavered at the edges. "You didn't call me back last night." She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together in a nervous dance. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost lost in the hum of the heater. "I'm sorry," she said, her eyes still fixed on the floor. "I was busy." "Busy with what?" The question slipped out sharper than he intended, his tone rising with a mix of frustration and need. He didn't mean to sound accusatory, but the words carried the weight of his sleepless night, the hours spent staring at a silent phone, the note he'd found in his mailbox weeks ago. "She's playing you" still crumpled in his coat pocket. He needed to know, needed her to fill the void of uncertainty that had swallowed him whole. She hesitated, her breath catching audibly. Then she looked up at him, her green eyes meeting his for the first time that day. And there was something in them he couldn't place. Guilt, maybe, or regret, or a plea he didn't know how to answer. "Jonathan," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to crack the shell of his composure. "I think we need to talk." The words landed like a stone in his gut, cold and unyielding. And he knew in that moment that whatever came next would unravel everything he'd built with her. Every kiss, every laugh, every night spent believing she was his. He gripped the edge of the desk tighter, bracing himself for the truth he'd feared all along. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He felt the room spin around him, his breath catching in his throat. "Talk about what?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. Us, it's not working," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think we need to end it." He stared at her, his mind racing. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice cracking. I thought we were happy." She looked away, her eyes filled with guilt. "We were," she said softly. "But it's complicated." "Complicated how?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Emily, what's going on?" She hesitated, then looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I've been seeing someone else," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Jonathan. I never meant to hurt you." The words hit him like a sledgehammer, knocking the air out of his lungs. He felt his knees buckle, and he had to grab the edge of his desk to steady himself. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who is it?" She looked down at her hands, her cheeks flushed with shame. It's Professor Reynolds," she said softly. Jonathan felt the world tilt beneath him. Professor Reynolds, Mark Reynolds, was the math teacher, a colleague he had known for years. They weren't close, but they were friendly enough, exchanging pleasantries in the hallway and occasionally sharing a drink at faculty events. The thought of him with Emily, of them together, made Jonathan's stomach churn. "How long?" he asked, his voice trembling. "How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, then looked up at him, her eyes filled with regret. "A few weeks," she said softly. "I'm sorry, Jonathan. I never meant for this to happen." He felt a surge of anger, hot and blinding, and for a moment he thought he might lash out at her. But then he saw the tears in her eyes, the genuine remorse on her face, and the anger drained out of him, leaving him feeling empty and numb. "Get out," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just get out." She hesitated, then nodded, turning and walking out of the office without another word. Jonathan watched her go, his heart breaking with every step she took. He felt like he had been hollowed out, like there was nothing left inside him but pain and regret. In the days that followed Emily's confession, Jonathan Hayes tried to go on with his life, as if nothing had happened. He dragged himself through the motions of his routine with a mechanical precision that belied the chaos roiling inside him. Each morning he rose from his tangled sheets, the bed cold and empty without her, and forced himself to dress tweed blazer, pressed shirt, a tie knotted with trembling hands. He drove to Haverford College, under a sky that seemed perpetually gray, the snow-crusted campus a monochrome backdrop to his unraveling world. He taught his classes in the lecture hall, his voice steady as he dissected the mill on the floss, or parsed the metaphors of Keats, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. Students scribbled notes, oblivious to the hollow man at the podium, his eyes drifting to the seat near the front where Emily no longer sat. She'd dropped the class, he'd learned from a curt email to the registrar. After lectures, he retreated to his office, the cramped space a mausoleum of his former life. The bookshelves loomed around him, their contents, Middlemarch, Wuthering Heights, volumes of poetry, mocking him with memories of late-night discussions with her. He graded papers at his desk, the red pen slashing across pages with a ferocity he didn't recognize, his comments terse and unforgiving. Faculty meetings were a blur of droning voices and lukewarm coffee, held in the overheated lounge where he sat stiffly in a corner, nodding at the right moments while his mind churned elsewhere. To the outside world, he was the same Professor Hayes, witty, reserved, a touch eccentric, but it was all a facade, a brittle mask that cracked a little more with each passing hour. Inside, he was falling apart, a man unmoored, drowning in a sea of his own making. He couldn't stop thinking about Emily. Her face haunted him, flickering behind his eyelids like a ghost that refused to fade. The way she had looked at him in his office that Wednesday morning, those green genes clouded with something he now understood as guilt, replayed in an endless loop, her voice, soft and trembling as she'd said, "I think we need to talk," echoed in his ears, followed by the confession that shattered him. She'd been seeing someone else, Mark Reynolds, a senior in the philosophy department, a lanky kid with tousled blonde hair and a smug grin Jonathan had seen around campus. She'd met him at the library months ago, she'd admitted, her words halting as she twisted her hands together. It started as a friendship, then spiraled into something more, something she hadn't meant to happen, she claimed. Though her excuses rang hollow to him, he couldn't stop thinking about the way she had touched him. Either, those stolen moments that had once lit his world now twisted into something cruel, the memory of her fingers brushing his in the hallway, her lips pressing against his in the dim light of his office, her body warm against his on the rug by the fireplace. All of it replayed with a bitter edge. Each touch, each kiss, had been a lie. A performance staged while she carried on with Mark behind his back. He saw them now in his mind's eye, Emily laughing at Mark's jokes in the library stacks, her head resting on his shoulder during late-night study sessions, their hands intertwined as they walked across the quad. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he'd ever felt before, a jagged wound that bled anew every time he pictured them together. He had trusted her, loved her with a ferocity that scared him, and she had thrown it all away for someone else, someone younger, someone who fit her world in a way he never could. The anger simmered inside him, slow burn that grew hotter with each passing day. It started as a quiet ember, flickering in the wake of her confession, but it fed on itself, fueled by sleepless nights and the relentless churn of his thoughts. He found himself fantasizing about revenge, dark imaginings that crept into his mind unbidden as he sat alone in his house. The Victorian relic on the edge of town, once their sanctuary, was now a prison of memories, her scarf still draped over the armchair, a half-empty bottle of wine they'd shared lingering on the counter. He'd stare at the fireplace, the logs unlit since she'd last been there, and picture confronting her. He'd imagine storming into her dorm room, her eyes widening in shock as he demanded answers she couldn't give. Or he'd see himself tracking down Mark Reynolds, cornering him outside the philosophy building, his fists clenched as he spat accusations into the kid's startled face. Sometimes the fantasies escalated. He thought about exposing their affair to the entire school, drafting an email to the faculty listserv, detailing every sordid moment, or slipping an anonymous note under the dean's door with just enough truth to spark an investigation. He pictured the whispers spreading across campus, Emily's reputation unraveling, Mark's cocky grin wiped away by disgrace. But even as he spun these scenarios, he knew they wouldn't be enough. The humiliation might sting them, might satisfy him for a fleeting moment, but it wouldn't touch the core of his pain. He wanted more. He wanted her to feel the same agony that consumed him, to know what it was like to have your heart ripped out and stomped on, to wake each day with a void that swallowed everything else. He wanted her to suffer as he was suffering, to mirror the wreckage she'd left inside him. The days bled into nights, each one a little darker than the last. He stopped cooking, surviving on stale bread and coffee, the kitchen table littered with unopened mail and takeout containers he couldn't be bothered to throw away. His sleep, when it came, was fractured. Brief, restless dozes, punctuated by dreams of her. In one, she stood in his classroom, laughing as Mark pulled her away, their hands locked together while Jonathan shouted after them. His voice swallowed by silence. He'd wake drenched in sweat, his chest heaving, the ceiling above him a blank canvas for his spiraling thoughts. The anger grew, twisting into something uglier, something he barely recognized. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about him, about the fool he'd been, the life he'd let slip through his fingers for a lie. And then, one night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the idea came to him. It was late, past midnight, the house silent save for the creak of settling wood and the distant howl of wind outside. He hadn't slept in days. Not really. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin sallow, his mind a fog of exhaustion and rage. He lay on his back, the sheets twisted around his legs, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The room was dark, the only light, a faint sliver of moonlight slipping through the gap in the curtains, painting a silver line across the floor. He'd been replaying her confession again, her voice trembling as she'd said Mark's name, when the thought struck him like a thunderbolt, sharp, electric, and utterly wrong. He would kill her. The idea crystallized in an instant, blooming in the blackest corners of his mind, with a clarity that startled him. It wasn't a vague fantasy anymore, not a fleeting burst of anger to be dismissed by warming. It was a plan, a twisted solution to the pain that gnawed at him relentlessly. He saw it unfold in vivid detail, Emily stepping through his back door one last time, her smile faltering as she sensed something off. He'd lure her in with a promise, a talk, a reconciliation, his voice calm, his hands steady as he poured her a glass of wine. The bottle of sleeping pills in his bathroom cabinet flashed into his mind, crushed into powder, slipped into her drink while she looked away. She'd grow drowsy, her words slurring, her body slumping against him as he guided her to the couch, and then a pillow, maybe, pressed over her face. Her struggles weak and fading until she was still. He'd bury her in the woods behind the house, where the ground was soft and the trees thick, her grave unmarked, her absence a mystery no one would solve. He sat up in bed, his breath ragged, his heart pounding with a mix of horror and exhilaration. The room spun around him, the shadows shifting as if alive, and he pressed his hands to his face, trying to push the thought away. It was insane, monstrous, unthinkable. He wasn't a killer, he was a professor, a man of words and ideas, not violence. He'd spent his life analyzing the darkness in literature, not living it, but the idea clung to him, seductive in its simplicity, whispering that it was the only way to make the pain stop, to take back the power she'd stolen, to erase the betrayal that festered inside him. He could feel the weight of her body in his arms, the silence that would follow, the relief that might come with it. He stumbled out of bed, his legs unsteady, and crossed to the window, throwing it open to let the cold air slap against his skin. The wind roared in, sharp and biting, carrying the scent of snow and pine. He gripped the sill, his knuckles white, and stared out at the night, black and endless, a mirror to the void within him. He didn't sleep that night, or the next. The idea festered, growing roots, and though he fought it, though he told himself it was madness, a part of him wondered if it was already too late, if the man he'd been was gone, replaced by something darker, something capable of anything. Jonathan spent the next few days meticulously planning the murder. He knew he had to be careful, had to cover his tracks, but the thought of finally getting revenge filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in weeks. He started by researching poisons, looking for something that would be quick and painless. He didn't want her suffer, he just wanted her gone. He settled on a rare plant toxin that was virtually undetectable, ordering it online under a fake name. Next, he began to stalk her, watching her every move, learning her routine. He knew when she left her dorm, when she went to class, when she met Mark for their secret rendezvous. He knew where she went, who she talked to, what she did. He became obsessed, consumed by the need to know everything about her. Finally, the day came. He waited until she was alone, slipping into her dorm room while she was in the shower. He poured the poison into her water bottle, his hands trembling as he did so. He knew there was no going back, but he didn't care. He just wanted it to be over. He left the room as quietly as he had entered, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew it would only be a matter of time before she drank the water, before the poison took effect. He just had to wait. Emily's death was ruled a tragic accident, a case of food poisoning gone wrong. The school held a memorial service, and her family was inconsolable. Jonathan attended the service, his face a mask of grief. But inside, he felt nothing but relief. For a while, he thought he had gotten away with it. He went back to his routine, teaching his classes, grading his papers, and pretending to mourn the loss of a beloved student. But the guilt began to eat away at him, gnawing at his conscience until he could barely sleep at night. And then, one day, the police came knocking on his door. The investigation into Emily's death had uncovered a trail of evidence that led straight to Jonathan. His online search history, his purchase of the poison, his fingerprints in her dorm room, it was all there, a damning trail of guilt. He was arrested, charged with first-degree murder, and sentenced to death. As he sat in his cell waiting for the day of his execution, he thought about Emily, about the love they had shared, and the betrayal that had destroyed them both. And as the electric chair loomed closer, he realized that he had been wrong. Killing her hadn't made the pain go away. It had only made it worse. On the day of his execution, Jonathan Hayes sat in the electric chair, his hands trembling, his heart pounding in his chest. He thought about Emily, about the way she had looked at him, the way she had made him feel. He thought about the love they had shared, the life they could have had. And as the switch was flipped, as the electricity coursed through his body, he realized that he had been wrong about one thing. Love wasn't worth dying for. But revenge was.